Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. Today I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. John Kush with Auburn University. Over the next hour, John will be talking about similarities in the fire ecologies of the longleaf pine and ponderosa pine forests. I would like to take just a moment to share a little bit of information about the Southern Fire Exchange. SFE is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast. We're a collaborative among the University of Florida, Tall Timbers Research Station, North Carolina State University, and the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station. We're sponsored by the federally funded Joint Fire Science Program, and we're a southeastern branch of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network. Working with our network of partners, we develop programs, opportunities, and events that bridge the divide between the fire science and wildland fire and natural resource management communities so that land management outcomes improve and society can more safely live with wildland fire. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. John Kush is a research fellow, recently retired. Congratulations, John. In the School of Forestry and Wildlife Sciences at Auburn University. His Bachelor of Science degree in Forest Science came from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He received his master's and PhD both in forest ecology from Auburn. He's been conducting research for over 34 years with a focus on stand dynamics, fire effects, and restoration. He taught classes in forest ecology, forest measurements, longleaf pine measurement, restoration ecology, forest stand dynamics, fire ecology, and fire management, and natural resource sampling. He has authored and co-authored book chapters and numerous publications. He's a certified senior ecologist and was recently in 2017 inducted into the Alabama Foresters Hall of Fame. So congratulations, John. Welcome. We are excited to have you with us today. In one moment as we swap out my presentation and we bring up yours.
All right. Thanks, David, for that introduction, and hopefully my screen is visible. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. So as David said, we're going to be talking about the fire ecology of longleaf and ponderosa pine. And the outline for this talk is why talk about these two species together. How this came about is late last year, I was asked by the Alabama Prescribed Fire Council to talk about longleaf and ponderosa pine together. I was excited at the opportunity because I've spent my time doing longleaf here in the South, but you do have to study other species to get a better feel for what you might be able to do. And so ponderosa is sort of the bridge, I think, that helps. A historical overview of the forest will be given. And I really like what David put on the opening slide of how history can be your guide. I tell students quite a bit that seems to be lost on them, that they avoid history. We'll get a little bit into the ecology of the species. Since I've done longleaf work for 30 some years, I am going to rant a little bit about longleaf, more history, and then a conclusion.
Hey, John,
yes.
We cannot see your screen. So let's try that share again.
It was lost. Yes, I've had troubles. We had a bit of a power glitch here.
Oh.
And so.
All right, we're making progress. Let's see if you hit.
Is it there?
There it is. That's it. We got it. Thanks.
Now I will try to annotate and get the spotlight. Maybe we're back. All right.
You got it.
So you've heard my words. You can not worry about the outline because we'll be going through that. So why longleaf? Pinus palustris. Here's the first part of my rant that Pinus australis was originally longleaf pine, but it got changed by Miller to palustris, which means swampy and marshy. Today we hear so many people talk about longleaf pine is only for a sandy site. Well, that is incorrect. Ponderosa pine, ponderosa means heavy. How it got that apparently is related to maybe it being originally thought of as red pine. So So the longleaf pine range, the coastal plain for the most part, from Virginia over to Texas, up into the mountains of Alabama and Georgia. People in the Southeast have seen that range. But then you look out west and Ponderosa pine, here's a range map with its subspecies, anywhere from 4 to 6 subspecies. And that's for geneticists to get into, but it is the principal species on over 27 million acres, which is really incredible to think about. Is longleaf pine, which originally was anywhere from 60 to 90 million, and now down to about 4, but still Ponderosa principal species, 27 million acres with the greatest concentration in California, followed by Oregon, then Arizona and New Mexico. And this is a really important map to consider. Guyette, Stambaudet, and Musica in 2012 in Ecosystems put together this map of historic fire frequency for the 48 states, based on tree ring studies, on pollen, animal records, a whole variety of things. And by a sort of big picture, still it's the important things to think about for longleaf pine, the fire frequency, usually less than 4 years. Central Florida, Southeast Georgia, fire return interval could be less than 2 years. And then, you got to think about the West Coast. And so when you overlay the range of Ponderosa pine onto their fire frequency map, you can see that the fire return intervals there for much of California should probably be less than 4 years. And that's certainly something that has not been happening there in quite some time. You get up into eastern Washington and looking at the range there, you transfer over to the fire frequency map. And again, a much shorter fire return interval than probably many people really think about having had happened for this Western species. But even in Arizona and New Mexico, again, still that more frequent fire return interval, which has been essentially ignored from my perspective. And so where else do you begin when asked to do something is you go to Google, because it has the answer to everything that we need to know in life. And so you go to Google Scholar. I typed in Ponderosa pine fire ecology, 36,000 hits, which amazed me. You type in longleaf pine fire ecology and 14,700 hits. So having spent all this time in the Southeast and longleaf pine, I thought for sure longleaf pine would have much more in the way of hits for fire ecology, but more than twice the number of articles out there published dealing with Ponderosa pine fire ecology than with longleaf. And so now to start to bring sort of that comparison between the two systems. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have a picture from Greenwood Plantation, having been periodically burned for 75 years. So longleaf pine dominating the overstory, essentially a single species in the overstory, probably for the most part. Understory looking very open, and the ground cover looking to be predominantly dominated by grasses and forbs. You move over to the right-hand side. Here you have Ponderosa pine in Malay Gap, Arizona. Caption said natural lightning fires happening every 6 or 7 years. So that same sort of depiction of an ecosystem dominated by essentially one single tree species. The understory again dominated by grasses and forbs. And so where did that photo come from? The Tall Timbers Research Station put together in 1973 a publication, Ponderosa pine, Ponderosa fire management. And so if you can get miscellaneous publication number 2, and it is a fantastic read, and you open it up, and there, a couple of pages in, are those two photos side by side. So the authors of that pub bringing the two species together to show you that there is really very little difference between the two, despite one being a southeastern dominated species and the other one going a few thousand miles to the west and occurring across the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific coast. So now sort of providing a historical overview of these two systems. Bartram, 1791, traveling through the Southeast, writes that this plain is mostly a forest of the great long-leaved pine, the earth covered with grass, interspersed with an infinite variety of herbaceous plants, and embellished with extensive savannas, always green, sparkling with ponds of water. And so then a few photos from Alabama. Here, Chilton County, this is for those of you familiar, sort of with Alabama, this is between Montgomery and Birmingham, 1943, taken by Roland Harper. And Harper was a geographer slash geologist for the state of Alabama for 30 years. And he spent a good portion of the early 1900s just traveling the state and documenting the forest types and then trying to relate them to what the climate, the soils, and the physiography were. And so here you've got Chilton County, which is somewhat of a hilly area and rocky, very open understory, some dry site oak species in the mid-story, and then longleaf pine dominating the overstory. Coosa County, Alabama, turpentining happening in a portion of Alabama that we would not have thought of. So this is 1913. So this is again in sort of a rocky area. Quite often people think that turpentining just happened along the coastal areas of Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. But here in the hills of Alabama, they were turpentining. And then moving to Walker County, and this is an area northwest of Birmingham, 1906, Harper showing longleaf pine dominating the overstory, understory dominated by grasses and forbs. And so now moving out to the west, Edward Beale, 1857, traveling through northern Arizona. It is the most beautiful region I ever remember to have seen in any part of the world. A vast forest of gigantic pines, intersected frequently with open glades, sprinkled all over with mountain meadows and wide savannas, and covered with the richest grasses, was traversed by our party for many days. And so, again, his description is very similar to that of Bartram. He certainly hadn't read Bartram's book, so those were his own words. And then Weaver, 1961, talking or showing a photo of Ponderosa pine forest in southern Washington, and the caption to his photo is, "The open park-like appearance still prevails on limited portions of the Ponderosa pine forests in the upper Klickitat drainage. Ground cover consists principally of pine grass. Almost all of Cedar Valley once looked like this." So again, trying to show the two systems a few thousand miles apart and looking very, very similar. So now delving into the ecology of these two species, both historically were forests that contained many small even-age groups rather than having sort of a true uneven-age structure. So longleaf pine, an opening would happen in the forest, lightning strike, wind throw, something would create an opening, and longleaf pine regeneration would fill in that area, quite often to the density of more than 1,000 seedlings per acre. Ponderosa pine, again, in a very similar form, filling in gaps created by some event in nature. Both species pretty much occur on most any soil type within their range. Longleaf pine's elevation, sea level to 1,800 feet. Ponderosa pine from sea level to 10,000 feet. Longleaf pine seems to be limited probably by ice and or cold, or maybe more directly lack of fire happening at higher elevations. I need to delve into the start of the rant. You look at this map put together by NRCS on the right-hand side of the screen. So whatever you see there in green, according to NRCS, is soils suitable for longleaf pine. So that pretty much says most of the state of Alabama could have longleaf pine. This portion of Alabama, which is not part of the range of longleaf pine in Alabama is this red line. This portion of the state is the prairie belt or the black belt region. So heavy soils, basic soils, not really suited to any pine growth, not just longleaf. But the rest of the state, again, other than near drainages, flatter rivers, like in Escambia County, where you got the Conecuh River, that have wide floodplains. The other thing longleaf won't occur on is on soils that are inundated by water, especially in the wintertime. So again, getting away from that notion that longleaf pine is just a dry site or a sandy species. It pretty much can be grown on any soil type over most of the southeast. In terms of seed production, no regularity in the two species. For both, pretty much average interval between heavy cone crops, something that might be considered for regeneration, is about 8 years. And why they produce those heavy cone crops is an unknown. It's a heavy seed, both species, not disseminated very far. For both of them, probably at most 120 feet from the parent tree. And you look into the literature on ponderosa pine, they talk about its distribution seems to be limited by the amount of summer rainfall. So that may be the trigger there. With longleaf pine, it's probably more of in terms of cold weather and frost and freezing that might happen, heaving seedlings out of the ground. Both species have buds with thick outer scales to help protect the tissue from heat. Here, longleaf pine with a very large bud compared to the other southern pines, and the needles that wrap around the bud, so providing protection quite early in life for the tree that stays there through its remainder. Both have long needles with higher moisture content than many of the other pines. And again, that protection around the bud. So here, saplings out of the grass stage, longleaf pine having been burned in the wintertime. And so you can see ground up the needles, but the new green needles there around the tip of the bud doing just fine. And then bark. Longleaf pine having thick bark, ponderosa pine can take fire when the basal diameter reaches only 2 inches, so pretty impressive there. And exfoliating bark, which has a tendency to slough off when the bark is on fire. And so that is, again, one of the ecological things that nature provided both of these species. Now, it does have to be pointed out that this now has become a problem for both trees when fire is lacking and a heavy mulch layer develops. We talk about duff donuts being created around the bases of trees, that you get this organic material that can be developed when fire has been suppressed for years or decades, that then becomes very problematic when trying to reintroduce fire or in the event of a wildfire. So in terms of fire return intervals, longleaf pine, depending on where you're at in the range, might have been 1 to 10 years. Again, this is going to be very site specific. Ponderosa pine, 2 to 47 years. That 2 to 47 years has been the result of fire scar research, which has been rather in depth. I think the thing with longleaf is to remember that it is site specific, that you just can't, what happens in the coastal plain and what happens in the upper coastal plain, the Piedmont or the mountains, can be quite different in terms of when fire would have happened, which would be related also to the fuels that you would have had with those systems. And so I know you can't read this, but if you have a chance to take a look at Fitzgerald's publication talking about the fire ecology of ponderosa pine and the rebuilding of the ecosystem, Pacific Southwest General Technical Report 198 provides a great summary of studies that have been done looking at fire return intervals. And so you can see pretty much the whole geographic region for ponderosa pine has been covered from Washington, Rocky Mountain states, South Dakota, Oregon, Northern California, Arizona, New Mexico. So just the wealth of information that is out there in terms of thinking about what the fire return intervals should be and what we need to be thinking about management of this species. So longleaf pine, in terms of fire seasonality, historically would have been in the lightning season, which is the period March, April, going into probably October. For Ponderosa pine, it was sort of location dependent, looking through the literature. North Central Washington, 80% seemed to be late growing season fire from looking at fire scars. Eastern Oregon, research there showed no consistent timing. Northern California, 93% dry midsummer through early fall. And then Arizona, 40% seemed to be late spring, 60% seemed to be July to September. So that is going to be very location oriented in terms of what happens. But for longleaf, again, its evolution would have been fire during the growing season, during when lightning strikes, lightning storms would have been happening. So longleaf, by far the most tolerant conifer in the southeast. Ponderosa, by far the most tolerant conifer in the west, and both very well suited to survive the frequent low intensity fires that would have dominated their portions of the landscape. And so the result then is the open and park-like forests that were written about in the early 1900s by researchers. So now I have to delve into my longleaf pine rant because that's at least what I'm most familiar with. And this happened a few years ago at a Southeastern Society of American Foresters meeting where I gave a talk about fire and longleaf pine and talked about using fire in the growing season, using fire frequently. And I can see a gentleman sort of off to my right mumbling and gnashing his teeth. And I finished my presentation and said any questions, and he raises his hand and said, "We planted longleaf pine 11 years ago, and now the stand looks like garbage. It is filled with loblolly and sweet gum. There's a bunch of us that will never plant it again." I said, "Okay, I said, so how often did you burn it?" And his response was, "We never did. We do not recommend using fire in young pine stands," to which I muttered an expletive and said, "I can't help you here because if you're not using fire with longleaf pine, there is no point in planting it and or managing it. Fire needs to be frequent. Fire needs to be early in its life." And so here's something a little bit closer to home. Since this is associated with Auburn University, this is a sign out at a site on one of our demonstration forests that was taken down by Hurricane Opal. It was site prepped, hand planted in longleaf. They spent $314 per acre to create a longleaf pine forest. And so this is the longleaf pine forest. It was planted at about 450 trees to the acre. And so if you have a seed source nearby of loblolly or sweet gum, it is going to fill in your stand if it is not burned. And so this is not an open park-like forest. This is what it looks like from the ground. So just looking beyond that sign, this is looking into the stand. This tree here is the only longleaf pine that is visible in this photo. So sort of a sad state of affairs. And as part of 2 classes that I taught, we went in there and measured the stand. So 2014, there were 75 longleaf per acre, well over 500 loblolly and hardwood stems per acre. The basal area, 10 square feet for longleaf pine, 70 square feet for loblolly, 56 square feet of hardwood basal area. And again, they spent what, $300 and some per acre to plant longleaf pine. And sadly, there are people who still refer to that as a longleaf pine plantation to this day, which is just mind-boggling. In no way, shape, or form is that a longleaf pine plantation because they never burned the stand. Fire was not used in the stand because of, like the gentleman asked me or made the comment, is we don't burn young pine stands. Well, longleaf pine is not our other southern pines. So here's an 8-year-old loblolly pine plantation in central Alabama, never burned, and is probably still a few years away from being able to burn it safely. You might be able to get a nighttime backing fire to move through there and not do any damage, but really difficult to do. And then not too far away from that area, here is an 8-year-old longleaf pine plantation that the landowner has managed with fire, and I think rather effectively. It has been burned 3 times since planting. So for me, this is a great example of what a longleaf pine plantation should look like at 8 years old. You've got seedlings of different sizes out there. You just never know when the species is going to come out of its grass stage. But so, having been burned 3 times, these seedlings and saplings have had no trouble withstanding that frequent of a fire. So what's happened to ponderosa pine forests over time? Increase in ponderosa on the surrounding hills. So here on the right-hand side, this was a picture taken in 1874 when George Custer was coming through the Black Hills. And so you can see very open ecosystem, pines dominating, sort of the hills there. And then you move into the right-hand side, and then in 2000, from about the same vantage point, now the hillside in the back, solid in trees, most of them not ponderosa pine, and the hillside, so only the open grassy area that may be dominated by wildlife or something, but something, fire has been removed from this system, and so they have filled in with other species. And then moving over to Montana in a photo series on the left-hand side, 1909. So a photo sort of similar to what David had on the opening slide. You just don't have the basal area or the number of trees in the slide as the slide David had on the front of the gentleman standing there, but very open. And so fire had been excluded since 1895. As you go on, 1948, it's beginning to fill in with other species. And then 1989, the last time somebody went out there, you have white fir, Douglas fir, and a number of other species that have now overtaken the understory underneath the ponderosa pine overstory. And then from Biswell, 1958, left-hand side, second growth ponderosa pine at Hoburgs before burning, and makes the comment, note the understory of dead manzanita and the extremely high fire hazard. Right, the area's broadcast burn, after which the dead manzanita was burned in small piles. So the great reduction in wildfire hazard is apparent. So here's something in the 50s talking about the risk of the ponderosa pine forest filling up with other material, the loss of the grasses and the forbs, and having done some work on the right-hand side, being able to leave it more open and reducing that wildfire hazard, which is such a problem today. Weaver, 1943, from the Journal of Forestry. His figures, this stagnating stand of 37-year-old reproduction is typical of dense even-age stands of ponderosa pine that have developed since the advent of total fire exclusion. So, which I find interesting, in the 1940s already somebody talking about fire exclusion in ponderosa pine systems. If you get a chance to read any papers by Weaver, he did some really great work, some basic research that I think is sort of missing today. Then moving on to the next photo that he had, a portion of the stand shown in figure 1 has appeared in 1941 after being thinned by a surface fire in 1914. In the background and to the right can be seen the edge of stagnating thicket along the outside of the 1914 fire line. So again, looking at that difference between what had been burned and not burned. And of course, well, the West Coast does not produce vegetation like we do here in the South. It's amazing what we can grow in a few years' time. So other portions of the country don't produce the fuels that we do, which I think is something really important for us to be thinking about in terms of fire. And then the third photo is the stand near Badger Creek in Oregon. Is typical of vast areas of ponderosa pine, where as a result of total fire exclusion, dense even-age stands of Doug fir reproduction are monopolizing the ground under the mature ponderosa pines. So they get that out west. Here in the south, we can get water oaks, sweetgums, magnolias, hollies, the loss of grasses and forbs. So different species to contend with, but the issue's still the same. So now sort of getting into the historical comments to serve as my almost final remarks. So going back to history. Biswell's final remarks from that miscellaneous publication number 2 is that fire has played an integral role in the evolution of the ponderosa pine. Through a long evolutionary period, its preservation as a species was assured by the development of resistance to fire. Periodic lightning set fire occurring at the intervals of about 6 to 7 years maintained low fuel levels. Really important, point I think to keep in mind. As fires were usually of low intensity and effectively pruned back woody competing vegetation, prepared a receptive soil surface for seed fall, and thinned seedling regeneration to prevent the development of stagnated dog-haired thickets of reproduction. One of the most primeval-like ponderosa pine forests area remaining in the western U.S. is located in the Lake Gap area of the San Carlos Indian Reservation. We urge the San Carlos tribe to set aside this area as a natural reserve for observation, comparison, and ecological research. In certain places, there has been no logging or fire control previous to 1947. If such a reserve is established, controlled burning at 6 to 7 year intervals is recommended. When fuels have been reduced, lightning set summer fires may be permitted to run their course with minimum surveillance. So the idea there, of Biswell talking about needing to get back to that, we had an example from the 40s that said fire in ponderosa pine at that 6 to 7 year intervals keeps things in a relatively safe condition, that if a fire does start in the summertime, it shouldn't be of a concern, unlike the fires that we have today in most ponderosa pine systems that can become catastrophic. And then Gifford Pinchot here, 1899, and this goes back to the comment that the forester made, is writing on National Geographic, almost all trees readily yield to slight surface fires during the first 10 to 15 years of their life. To this statement, longleaf pine is a conspicuous and rare exception. And so I think that's something we need to get back to. For my research days, I always tried to find funding to plant loblolly pine and longleaf pine side by side in a comparison, let them grow for 1 year, and then burn them both, come back 2 years later, burn them both. And then I would say, okay, at the end of 10 years, what are you going to have? And of course, everyone says, well, you're not going to have loblolly pine. They'll have been killed by fire. And that's the point, is fire will kill pretty much any other tree seedling other than longleaf pine because of its evolutionary characteristics. So quite often, we make comparisons to loblolly pine with longleaf, that loblolly is going to outgrow longleaf pine. And yes, that is true on pretty much any site. Longleaf will get burned, loblolly won't. But if you put fire into that mix, and on any site, longleaf pine will win because the loblolly is not going to be able to withstand the fire. So we need to put things on an even playing field when talking about different species and making comparisons. And then Chapman, who was a Yale professor. He spent 30 years bringing his students from Yale down to the South in the summertime. And they camped out in South Mississippi and Louisiana in canvas tents. Can you imagine doing that today? But 1932, he talks about longleaf pine type as a climax forest. And he wrote that it must be emphasized that a forest type is the form of vegetation best adapted to survive not merely a few select conditions like soil and climate, but all the conditions that arise over the lifespan of the individual trees of which it is composed. In the longleaf pine type of the South, fire at frequent but not necessarily annual intervals is as dependable a factor of site as is climate or soil. And the conception of a climax type as one which has reached a stage of permanent equilibrium or perfect adaptation to these constant factors of site should include the longleaf pine type of the South, which presents by far the greatest area and most permanent characteristics of any climax to be found in the United States. And so, from the ecological side of things, we often think that vegetation present in an area is that which is there based on soils and climate. And Chapman goes on to argue that here in the South, you've got to put fire into that mix as being just like soils or climate in terms of what the vegetation can be. So quite often we talk about fire as a disturbance, and for me, in the longleaf pine type of the South, the lack of fire is the disturbance. Taking fire out of the system disturbs longleaf pine. It cannot compete with other species, and so it is going to be lost out. And so that for me is the disturbance. There's no fire within a longleaf pine system. So if you're growing longleaf pine, if you're planting it, if you're not using fire, then you need to be managing for some other species because it has to have fire. And then Wallenberg, 1946, wrote that mismanagement of longleaf pine has been the rule rather than the exception due to the ignorance of the unique life history and incomplete knowledge of factors determining the life and death of seedlings, and hence the succession of forest types. So again, thinking about, we need to be acknowledging the ecology of whatever the species is that we're dealing with. So longleaf pine is going to have to be frequent fire. Ponderosa pine is going to need frequent fire. If you're managing bottomland hardwoods, then you're not talking fire, you're talking about some other characteristics, but whatever it is, know what the ecology of that species is. And I love this cover on Wallenberg's book, is you've got this overstory tree, the parent tree, and Wallenberg has all these longleaf pine seedlings underneath that tree. And as you get further and further away from the tree, the seedlings are growing a little bit taller because of less competition. So quite often people will say longleaf pine cannot regenerate under itself. Well, it had to regenerate under itself. Otherwise, it would have been lost from the landscape. So Wallenberg there, absolutely right in terms of there were seedlings there. They were just waiting for their chance to grow once this tree was lost. And then Chapman got really into the prescribed burning issue. In 1947, in terms of what was happening with the Forest Service, they were trying to get rid of fires. They wanted total fire exclusion, especially in the South. And so he writes a paper where he talks about his first observations on the ecology of fire occurred in Missouri's in the Ozarks, 1907, where fires evidently caused the destruction of practically all small shaded seedlings of shortleaf pine. But in 1908, in the longleaf pine hills of north central Alabama, the absolute necessity of a ground fire to expose mineral soil was demonstrated on contrasted areas where the seed crop was so large that every wormhole in the rotten logs contained a sprouting seedling pine. At that time, the writer concluded that close observation of ecological behavior must be substituted for precepts inculcated in the classroom and in existing practice, and that for a given species and region, the behavior of the species and its reaction to environment might not conform to that of other species in distant regions with different environment. This seemed like a sensible view in the light of the fact that man proposes, but nature disposes, and that only by conforming with natural laws can he turn them to his benefit, as he has done in agriculture. So the idea there of Chapman focusing on the ecology of a species, that we have to pay attention to what that species is, and again, the fact that you really need to look at things on a site-specific basis. That quite often what we learn in the classroom is very narrow in focus, and we need to open our eyes and look around and see everything that is there to think about just what might be going on. And he added that our investigation of the ecological role and fire was fortunately located permanently in Urania, Louisiana from 1920 to date on the land of Henry Hartner, whose willingness to cooperate in actually applying the technique of prescribed fire and taking the risk on his own property, the South, and the profession we owe a debt which can never be repaid. By 1926, it had been learned that a fire preceding the seed fall was only the first step. Exclusion of subsequent fires had the following results: prevented all subsequent establishment of longleaf pine seedlings, permitted competing species of pines and hardwoods to exterminate established longleaf pine seedlings by shade, most important of all, permitted brown spot disease to defoliate, stunt, and kill the seedlings and decimate the stand. So somebody in the 20s, private landowner, taking it upon himself to use fire in his longleaf pine stand, going against the conventional wisdom that was by the federal government, the U.S. Forest Service at the time, of preventing all fires. So here's somebody who understood the ecology of the species and was using fire to help keep longleaf pine there on his property. So I'm now sort of getting to the take-home messages and focus on the next few slides. This was a photo provided to me from Sharon Herman, who's actually here at Auburn University in the Department of Biology. I want you to take a look at the ground cover and the structure of that ground cover. Focus on that. So you can see you've got some grasses here. It's a pretty good coverage of low woody shrubs, a little bit of palmetto. It looks pretty decent. If you had this, you'd say, this is great. And then take a look at this picture. Here, the ground covered its structure, a much heavier grass component. You still have a little bit of palmetto there, maybe some woody shrubs there. But most of what you're seeing is a really heavy component of grasses. And so then you put the two of them together, and this is a photo Sharon took in the month of October. This area had been experiencing fire annually for close to 30 years. So this side getting burned in February, this side being burned in May. And so the critical take-home message is thinking about what the understories are and what they're dominated by, and the seasonality of the fire. So frequent fire, you keep your understory very open, but this frequent fire in February keeps a woody component there. So if you remove fire for a couple of years, this woody component then becomes a few feet tall and taller and taller. Here, you don't have anywhere near that extensive woody cover. So areas dominated by grasses. Here, one of the slides I use in class is buffalo roamed in Alabama. Now, buffalo needs, 200 pounds of grass a day, I think, to be able to live. So this is the component that Alabama had to have had in order for buffalo to have been here. So the big difference between fire in the dormant season and fire in the growing season is just so dramatic here in the Southeast. And then Stephen Pine, 1982, in a chapter, part of a chapter that was entitled "Our Pappies Burn in the Woods, the Fire History of the South." And to me, one of the take-home messages is the fire history of the South is in good part a history of its fuels. And that's, I think, what we keep coming back to. If you're burning woody stuff, you're going to have potentially much more heat. It's going to be more difficult to ignite. As to burning grasses, much easier to burn, lower intensity fires for the most part. So it's that happens here. We can develop fuels in a couple of years' time. Out west, it takes longer to get the amount of fuels that they have out there today. So we've got to be thinking about what we're burning and trying to potentially change the fuels to a more grass, herbaceous dominated understory, as opposed to much of the woody dominated understories that we have in many of our longleaf pine forests. And so for my concluding remarks, ecological change for the two species, heavy grazing and active fire suppression after 1910, certainly disrupted the natural fire regime. Overgrazing was very prevalent in the south as it was out west. Here, probably not so much of a problem because of our more frequent rain that we get, but big impact of grazing out west, where sometimes entire systems where the understory was changed from a grass component to a woody component. What forests were left had above normal fuel accumulations and abundant tree regeneration, certainly still quite prevalent in the West today. And where logging removed many of the larger trees other species filled in. For out west, Douglas fir and true firs, for ponderosa pine, which then created ladder fuels. Here in the south, quite often when longleaf was logged, usually replaced by loblolly and or slash pine, depending on the location, and then other species. And then to think about this, Biswell, 1958. Biswell was a professor at University of California, Davis. And his paper, Prescribed Burning in Georgia and California Compared. So if you can find this paper in the Journal of Range Management, there's a few paragraphs that just, for me, blew me away. It talked about the number of days suitable for burning. The number of days suitable for prescribed burning varies from spot to spot, depending on the combination of objectives and fuel conditions. A day suitable for burning one area may not always be suitable for another. In Georgia, records were never kept of the number of days suitable for prescribed burning on the experimental range. However, there were never more than 20 to 25 days per winter when all favorable conditions combined for safe, effective burning in any one spot. In California, however, records have been kept for 4 seasons of the days suitable for prescribed burning at Hoburgs. These records extended over the period from the time the duff and upper soil were first thoroughly wet in the fall to April 1 of the next year. The number of days varied from 47 to 74 per season for the 4 periods. Once ponderosa pine needles are thoroughly wet, the lower layers dry out slowly, providing long periods for prescribed burning. For example, in January and February for 1952 to 53, burning was possible for 29 successive days. It's an incredible thing about it. Just think if we could do that here in the South, before the lower layers became so dry that much of the duff was destroyed. Again, in 55, 56, prescribed burning was possible on successive days for a full month. The greater number of days suitable for burning in California than in Georgia was due mainly to the slower drying out of the fuel next to the soil and less to the importance of direction and wind intensity. So the idea that California, they are able to burn, there are conditions, the conditions were there for them to burn on any number of days. So just imagine if we here in the South, as somebody who's teaching fire class right now, I've really had no days to burn since December 1. So it's a difficult road for us here. So where are we at today with longleaf and ponderosa in terms of fire reintroduction? Prescribed burning is limited due to heavy accumulations of surface and ladder fuels. It's very difficult. Certainly there's a problem with longleaf in terms of older trees and potentially killing them when you start to get heavy accumulations of fuels. Other mechanical treatments are being used prior to burning to reduce fuels. Mowing, pruning's happening, thinning. Herbicides have certainly been useful here in the South in terms of working on competing vegetation to alter the fuels. You don't see much mention of herbicides with ponderosa pine, at least that I could find in the literature. And so for longleaf, the fuels are not the same as what it evolved with. We have different fuels out there than historically would have happened. And the season is not the same. Much of the burning we're doing is in the dormant season or in the winter time. Part of that's just related to smoke issues, but it's something we have to be really concerned about. And so for longleaf, you've got to be burning it early in life. You need to be burning it often in life. And the reality is you need to be burning it in growing season. So we need to be doing whatever we can to keep burning, and we don't need to give people reasons to stop us from doing prescribed firework. It's critical for the South. It's been part of our culture. It's part of our way of life. And so with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time and attention. If you go out to Mount Rushmore, they're sort of framing the faces of the presidents are ponderosa pines. So thank you very much.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much, John. Once again, if you joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director for the Southern Fire Exchange program. And like I said, this was a presentation we just listened to from Dr. John Kush with Auburn University. At this point, we have some time remaining till the top of the hour for questions and answers from the audience. And if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A window in Zoom. I see that we have a few questions and comments that have already come in, and we'll go ahead and start addressing those. But if you have comments or questions for John, you can go ahead and type them in at that time, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. We had one that came in from Key Robertson in the chat panel. And Kevin says the paper that Charlie Ferris and I are working on would argue that the location of longleaf pine regeneration has more to do with the patterns of fire and particularly unburned patches mediated by a lack of canopy cover rather than competition per se. John, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would be in agreement with that. It'll all depend on just how intense the fire was, what the fuels were like there. So I would go along with that in terms of just competition from the overstory, because that one I've seen time and time again. You've got seedlings showing up underneath the canopy of the parent tree. So it had to really be more having to do with what the fuels were and what the fire intensity was and when it happened. So I don't disagree.
That sounds like it gets to that ecology of fuels concept that Joe O'Brien and a lot of his co-authors have published and talked about. And if you're interested in that, if you go on to our Southern Fire Exchange YouTube channel, Joe gave a presentation either last year or the year before one of our webinars talking about the ecology of fuels. And that's certainly worth your time and worth diving into. It was very interesting. A question of my own, John, with 30 plus years of working in longleaf in the Southeast, I'm curious to know, what are the reference sites that you like to go to visit, or that you like to take folks to see when you're talking about a healthy or a functioning mature longleaf pine forest?
The best ones that I have seen would be Southwest Georgia, well, where you're at, tall timbers, the Greenwood Plantation, the Wade Tract. I have not seen many of the sites in Florida. I hear that areas in Central Florida look pretty good, but the reality is, for much of what I have seen, the fire regime has changed to a lot of winter fires that you've got understories dominated with a woody component, and so that sort of takes it away from me from being the the really nice area that you want to demonstrate. So that's what I tell people at Auburn is I don't have anything I can show you nearby of what to me it should look like. So I always say go to Southwest Georgia, ride the roads.
We have another question that came in from Steve. Would you be willing to share your presentation as a PDF after the fact?
Sure.
So, okay, great. Then I'll work with you, John, and we'll get that up on our website and linked to the YouTube recording as well. We had a couple folks asking about that. We had a question that has come in from Jeff, and it's a bit more specific. And he says, what season do you advise burning 2-year-old to 4-year-old longleaf that's still in the grass stage?
If you can burn in May or June, that would be my vote. The big thing is you don't want to have that bud, the white bud, exposed where you don't have needles around it. So quite often, March, April, when they're starting growth, that bud is in its most delicate form. So if you can burn them, but then it'll also depend on what your fuels are like. Can you get something to carry fire? So if you've got some grasses that maybe can carry fire and you got a windy day, that's when I would try to burn. But you've got to know what your fuels are and whether you can get them to ignite and carry fire or not. But the biggest thing is don't burn when that bud is all by its lonesome out there.
We had a question that came into the Q&A pod from Sonny H, and they're asking whether or not wild horses could be used to manage fuels in young stands of ponderosa pine.
I would have no idea, to be honest. It's certainly an interesting question, but not something I am at all familiar with.
Have you done any work in silvopasture in the Southeast?
Yes, which is something I try to promote with some landowners who are interested in both, because the combination of trees, fire is certainly quite suited to using for grazing animals. So I've seen some wonderful silvopasture demonstrations in the panhandle of Florida. They actually even have longleaf pine regeneration happening underneath, where they can kind of rotate cattle through. So, and something for people to consider if you've got a woody component. Goats or sheep can do a pretty effective job working at the woody component, at the same time still growing your trees and having something else that you can help maybe supplement your income with.
And let's see, we had a couple more questions coming in. Let's see. Some question about what are some of the native forbs or grasses to use in longleaf pine restoration in North Florida? Some specific species I think he's looking for.
I assume North Florida, you definitely wiregrass would be a big one to do. I think its range, wiregrass shows up in southeast Alabama, but as you get to sort of central Alabama, it disappears. So we had little blue stems, big blue stems, muley grasses. But if you can afford the wiregrass seed, that is a fantastic species to be able to work with, because it burns so readily, and quite often fire is needed for its helping it to propagate itself. So I'm all for wiregrass in that area.
And I know Kevin Robertson, who was on here earlier, has done some work on wiregrass flammability, and it seems that once you get that understory in good shape, it opens up more opportunities throughout the year for burning.
Yeah, no, agree. I mean, frequency is, you've got to have more frequent fire over most of our sites because we just grow so much stuff on a yearly basis.
So thank you everyone who joined us today. We appreciate you spending your afternoon with us. And thank you so much, John, for your presentation. And I think we all really enjoyed it.
Thanks, David.